In this video, we're going to be going over everything you need to know about the crop system in Farthest Frontier. One of the main pillars of the game and best sources of food comes from crops. But if you don't know how this system works, you may find your villagers withering away from starvation. Before you begin farming, you're going to want to find the most fertile land available to you. When starting a new map, take a moment to turn on the fertility overlay to identify the best areas to grow your crops. The deeper the green you can find, the better. Once you've found it, place your town center nearby so that you don't have to travel too far when managing your fields. Once you have a few early game necessities built, like your firewood splitter and initial housing, start building your first field. The reason for this is because it's going to take some time before the field is usable. I usually like to start by building 3 small fields next to each other, with the goal of the first field being completed by the end of my first year. You can have different sizes of fields depending on how you want to use them and the demand for food in your village. Bigger fields will be able to hold more crops but take longer to build. If you try rushing a large field early game with very few villagers, they may starve to death before the field is even completed. I recommend extending the size of your field as your village grows, or begin creating larger fields in a different area in anticipation for future growth once your smaller fields are established and producing crops regularly. After your first field is created, click on your field to bring up the planning interface. At first glance, the screen can be very daunting, but don't worry about it, we're going to go over everything. You'll immediately notice the 3 rows of seasons with the Roman numerals 1, 2, and 3 next to them. These are where you'll select what crops to plant and when during a given year in a sliding 3-year rotation. The top row represents your current year and where at in time you currently are. The second and third rows are for planning the second and third years of crops and potential maintenance. You'll notice that the rows mirror that of your seasonal timeline. On the far left represents the beginning of the year and very early spring, and then moving to summer and autumn, with the winter season on the far right. You can only plant and work in your fields during spring, summer, and autumn. You cannot do anything in your fields during the winter. This includes building your fields themselves, meaning that your villagers will stop building a field as soon as the winter season begins, pushing back your ability to begin using your field until sometime the following year. One other thing to keep an eye on is the number of workers assigned to your field. The maximum number you can assign to your field depends on its size. This value will automatically scale with the size of your field, even if you extend it later, including if you extend the largest default field size of 12 by 12. You can adjust the number of workers for your field on the top right of the field interface. To the left of the rows are 2 buttons, one for removing crops or maintenance for a given year, and the other for extending your field. On the bottom half of the screen are details about your field, including its current yield factors, soil mixture, estimated yield for the currently selected crop based on yield factors and soil, and previous and currently growing crops. Yield factors have 3 categories that play a critical role in the success of your field: fertility level, weed level, and rockiness. Fertility level is initially based on the fertility of the land the field was created on. Each crop you can plant in your field has a fertility level requirement to obtain the maximum amount of yield for that year. Weed level is the amount of weeds in your field. The higher amount of weeds, the less yield you'll receive from your growing crops. There are multiple ways to reduce the weed level, with the best being field maintenance. Most crops also provide some level of weed suppression, which can help control your weed level, but field maintenance is absolutely the best way to lower this value. However, you cannot grow crops during maintenance, and maintenance does not increase fertility. Rockiness indicates how rocky your field is and can only be lowered with field maintenance. The good thing is that once your field reaches 0 rockiness, you're good to go because rocks do not come back, at least not that I have seen. The level of fertility, weeds, and rockiness of your fields will greatly dictate what crops you should be planting in a given year. I typically like to spend about the first year to a year and a half after a field is first built just doing maintenance to reduce the amount of weeds and rocks in my field. Next is your soil mixture. This indicates the amount of clay and sand your selected crop needs to maximize its yield or even grow at all, depending on how balanced your soil is. The indicator bar shows a color gradient with green, yellow, and red. The white bar indicates the current soil mixture. Ideally, you want the white bar to be in the green area, which provides a bonus to your yield. If the white bar is in the yellow, your crop should still grow, but you won't receive any bonus to your yield. If the white bar is in the red, it will have a negative impact on your yield. If your current soil mixture is not in the green, you can adjust it by clicking on the left arrow to increase the level of clay, or the right arrow to increase the level of sand. One thing to keep in mind though is that you have to physically have clay and or sand in your village's storage to adjust either level. You can get sand and clay from nodes on your map by placing either a sand or clay pit on them, or by trading for them from visiting traders once you have a trade post in your village. Also keep in mind that the change is not immediate. It takes some time to get the materials from storage and apply it to your field, so you're going to have to be thinking ahead. Next is the estimated yield for your selected crop based on all of the factors we just talked about. The number on the left is an estimated yield given all of the variables at the time, and the number on the right is the number of seeds planted. The goal is to get the number on the left, your yield, as high as you possibly can, and if you've done everything correctly, it can easily be higher than the number of seeds you planted. You can also see the details of how the estimate is calculated by hovering over the eye icon. Below the estimated yield, you'll find the previous crop or maintenance of your field and the current crop or maintenance of your field. In both areas, if a crop is present, you can see the type of crop, the fertility level at the time of growing, how many seeds were planted, and how much was harvested. Lastly, on the bottom of the screen, you can see what crops, if any, are currently in the temporary storage of the field. Harvested crops will be stored here temporarily during harvesting. Once harvesting is completed, your villagers will transfer your crops from the field's temporary storage to a more long-term storage building within your village, such as a root cellar. Now that we've covered the main field interface and understand all of the elements and how they work, let's dig into the crops. To select crops to plant, simply click on any of the yearly rows to bring up the crop and maintenance selection window for that year. Once open, you'll see all of the crops available to plant that produce a yield for your villagers, as well as 2 maintenance operations. The first thing to note is that while there are a number of different types of crops, there are only 4 classes of crops: beans, root vegetables, grain, and greens. Flax and clover do not fall into any of these categories. Beans and peas are classified as beans. Turnips and carrots are classified as root vegetables. Wheat, buckwheat, and rye are classified as grains. Cabbage and leeks are classified as greens. Flax is used for making linens and does not have a classification that I can tell, and clover is used to increase the fertility of your field and does not yield any crop. One of the main mechanics in the farming system in Farthest Frontier is crop rotation. Crop rotation is the act of changing out the classes and types of crops you grow in your field each year. If you plant the same crops too many times in the same field, no matter if you do it across years, your field will become infected with crop diseases and affect the yield of the planted crop. To prevent this from happening, or to remedy it if it does happen, you'll need to plant a crop that is not affected by the current disease. For example, if you have developed bean wilt, this affects beans and peas. To remedy the disease in the field, you should pick a crop from another category, such as root vegetables, grains, or greens. Now that we've covered the different classes of crops and crop rotation, what's the difference between all these crops? Each crop has a set of stats that determine its yield, resistances, weed management, time to grow, soil impact, and dependence on soil fertility. Starting with the bean class, we have both beans and peas. Both types of crops have the same yield of 6, however start to differ significantly in their resistances. Beans have no frost resistance but maximum heat resistance, so you'll want to make sure you plant them in the late spring or early summer. Peas, on the other hand, are the exact opposite, with maximum frost resistance and no heat resistance, so you want to make sure you plant these as early in the year as you can. Both have high and very high tolerance for rocky soil, so you could plant these pretty early on in a field's life before you've had a chance to reduce its rockiness. Weed suppression for both bean crops is relatively low, so I wouldn't count on them really helping control your weed problem. I'm not going to talk about grow time for each crop that we go over, as I feel it's a relatively straightforward stat. The bigger the number, the longer it takes to grow. The value listed is the number of days it takes from planting to harvest completion. The only thing grow time really affects is the number of things you can do in your field in a given year, so keep that in mind when planning out your year of crops. The impacts fertility stat indicates if this will increase or decrease the level of fertility in your soil for that field. A negative number means it decreases your fertility, while a positive number indicates it will increase your fertility. Beans are the only other crop besides clover that help increase fertility. So you could use beans as a way to counteract some other crops that reduce the fertility in your field. Lastly, fertility dependence tells you what level of fertility your soil should be around in order to maximize your yield. Flax, wheat, cabbage, and leeks have some of the highest fertility requirements, so you'll want to try and get your soil fertility as high as possible to maximize those crops. Moving on to root vegetables, we have turnips and carrots. These have about the same yield as beans, with carrots coming out a bit on top. And like peas, both root veggies have a high tolerance to cold, but aren't great against heat. If you're going to plant these, do it early in the season. Now, unlike the bean class, your root vegetables don't handle as well in rocky soil, so it would be ideal to get your rockiness level down a bit before planting. As for fertility, your root vegetables don't have a significant negative impact on your soil, nor do they have a high fertility requirement. Rotating between beans and roots is a common method as they'll balance out the soil and are disease resistant to each other from most diseases. Next up, we have grains. Grains are used in the production of flour, which requires a mill in Tier 2, and beer from a brewery, which you get in Tier 3. There are 3 different types of grain: wheat, buckwheat, and rye. All grains are perfect for growing in the summer as they all have maximum resistances to heat. Frost, on the other hand, is a bit varied. Don't plant buckwheat early in the year because it has no frost resistance. Rye and wheat can be planted in mid to late spring with their high frost resistance in case of a random temperature drop. In addition to all grains having great heat resistance, they can also deal with very rocky soil. However, due to the high fertility requirements of rye, and especially wheat, buckwheat is really the only choice for planting while your soil is rocky. So with the mill being a Tier 2 building to produce flour from grain, you could use buckwheat in a newly built field after you've reached Tier 2. As an added bonus, it also has the highest weed suppression of any crop with only a moderate grow time. Last note on grains, watch out for the high negative impact on fertility that wheat and rye have on your field. It may even be best to rotate these crops between multiple fields to help combat the fertility loss and only plant them once per 3 rotation per field. Cruising right along over to our greens class of crops are cabbage and leeks. These are both great crops to grow for your villagers as they have the highest yield of any crop that are directly consumable and have incredibly high resistances to frost, heat, and rocky soil. However, they both also have some of the highest soil fertility requirements and have a moderate impact to your field's fertility. Lastly, they both have a very short shelf life for storage and can spoil easily, so you may want to make sure you're producing the right amount for the size of your village so you don't lose it to spoilage. The final crop we're going to take a look at that produces a yield for use within your village is flax. Flax doesn't produce a consumable for your villagers, but is used in the production of linen. Flax will be a crop you aim to have in the warmer seasons such as late spring and summer with its high heat resistance. Watch out for planting it too late because you can get early blizzards in autumn that could affect its yield due to only having a moderate frost resistance. Finally, in our crop selection window, you'll find your field maintenance and clover. You'll want to make sure you work in some field maintenance within your rotation to make sure the weeds are maintained in addition to any crops you plant that may help suppress weeds. Next to your field maintenance is clover. Clover should also be worked into your rotation on occasion to help increase fertility and lightly help with weed control. Now that we've covered all of your crop options, here's a small table I use as a quick reference guide on when you should plant each crop in a given year. Feel free to pause and take a screenshot and continue on when ready. Okay, with all of that out of the way, now we can talk about field defenses and composting. Once you have your field area designated, you're going to want to make sure you build fencing around it. Your field will automatically attract wildlife as your crops are growing each season, and without a wall, you can lose a significant portion of your yield to animals. Options for protecting your crops are simple wooden or stone fencing and a gate. These are relatively cheap to build, and you should begin building them even before your field is done. That way, you don't have to worry about forgetting and losing your crops to the local fauna. Finally, in our toolbox of farming is the compost yard. Using compost on your fields is the best way to apply a large boost in soil fertility. This is a Tier 1 building that you're going to want to place relatively early on, as not only will you use it for farming, but it will also ensure your villagers' homes remain free from waste. From a farming perspective, you want to get this placed sooner rather than later due to the amount of time it takes to collect enough waste from your villagers and then compost it. Once you've collected enough waste, it will automatically begin composting, and when it reaches 100%, a new icon will appear over the compost yard indicating there is compost ready to be used on a field. In order to apply compost to a field, simply click your compost yard, click the completed compost, and then find what field you want to use it on and select Apply Compost. Keep in mind that compost will be applied to the selected field the following year, so be sure to plan accordingly. Well, I think that covers just about everything, and you should now be on your way to mastering farming in Farthest Frontier. If you like this content, please consider subscribing to my channel where I post all of my Let's Plays, how-tos, and other videos. And don't forget to follow me on Twitch where you can watch me play live during the week. We'll see you next time.